Good afternoon, everybody. This session here, which is probably the reason why we have the room this size, was the most requested session of all in terms of the interest from the response forms that I had. So it really, I think, speaks to the importance of what we're trying to do. We had our first session on cyber spec language last year. Jeff, you chaired it. And when I visited the Axis A&E event, and we had a session on cybersecurity, and we discussed cyber liability, and many of the consultants there said, "Well, okay, I get it. I've got liability. What do we write?" And so one of the action items that I took away from that was to do a first draft of CSI format cyber specification language, which has been now posted on our website for 8 or 9 months under the cyber resources. And that wasn't designed to be originally complete or the last word, because this is a journey. This is not just a little hop. And so it's the intent here to have this type of dialogue and continuing dialogues and other resources to sort of refine model language and ideas that can be incorporated into a specification, a project spec that would include cybersecurity. I will say that I proposed to CSI for MasterFormat 2018 that not only should we leave cyber in Division 28 because we added it in MasterFormat 2016, but that it get added to every other division that touched the network. In their infinite wisdom, they came back and said, we already got in 28, we don't need it anywhere else, even though it says cybersecurity requirements for electronic safety and security. So the next go with them is going to be, well, at least put it in Division 27, which is communications. At least that makes sense because, it touches HVAC and process control. It touches 10 or 12 different divisions. It really does. And so educating them is part of the process here as well. So in putting this panel together, we're really striving for some balance. And so our panelists here, standing off to the side, I will let briefly introduce themselves, and briefly, because we have limited time, just what your role in the industry is, your firm, and your own personal connection to cybersecurity. So, Neil, why don't we start with you?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Neil Lakomiak. I lead business development and innovation for UL's Building and Life Safety Technologies Division. It's one of 8 different divisions at UL. I've been with the company pretty much all my life, right out of college, about 20 years now. I started out in engineering, various different engineering roles, and about 6 years ago, decided to go back to school and get a business degree, and have been doing business development since then. And so my main role is really helping clients bring new and innovative products to the market if they have new features, completely new platforms and services. Also work quite a lot on acquisitions and partnerships, and then also developing new services for our division, uniquely new services. So my involvement in cybersecurity started probably about 2.5 years ago. I've been in the life safety and security industry the whole time. So started out with fire alarm control systems and then made my way into security systems. We started about 2.5 years ago, just really out of kind of response of what we're hearing from our clients and other stakeholders in the industry about cybersecurity. There's lots of presentations about how bad it is, and a lot of kind of like scary talk about it. And so we decided, well, let's, instead of continue to talk about it, let's actually do something about it. And so
you're going to come back and talk about the UL standard, right?
That. Yeah.
So that's great. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks.
Jeff?
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Bauer. I'm responsible for the A&E program for Access Communications. And as you know, Access has been very well embedded in our cyber footprint, something that has been top of mind for us for quite some time. The challenges that we see, and one of the things that we're trying to do as an organization, is really bring awareness and try to provide solutions rather than just scaring everyone. And so I know that internally we have a lot of very solid practices that we use from an organizational standpoint, and from an A&E specification, things that you put onto paper. we have a lot of things that really help drive that initiative. But I think it's the challenge we have, and the reason why we're here is there's a bigger picture. And though we are not going to be the final say in all of this, we certainly want to bring some of our experience, bring some of our efforts to try to help you all understand as we serve the A&E community.
Thank you, Jeff. So Jeff covers, at least in this panel, the manufacturer perspective. And now I'm going to move down the line to Amy Williams. And I've just met Amy recently. She works along with John Palumbo. Many of you know John at Unlimited Technologies, and brings a very interesting background here to the discussion. So Amy, please.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming this afternoon. Thanks for inviting me, Ray. I'm Vice President of Cyber for PSB Xero. A lot of people know, as Ray mentioned, UTI Unlimited Technology, and John, Xero is a product for UTI that sits on top of physical security to provide a cybersecurity layer. One of the reasons they brought me in is that my background is cybersecurity. I also manage managed services company in Maine that is expanding out with cybersecurity based on the things I've done in the past. Prior to this, I was director of cybersecurity for the New York Crime Commission and worked closely with banks and the FBI to help secure companies in New York City. Prior to that, I helped architect a physician executive MBA program and helped the executive physicians design their own IT businesses and help them secure them and help them compete with all the information that was coming in. I was also a professor in a former life.
So Amy, I am remiss because I should have introduced you as Dr. Amy Williams.
That's okay.
And we're not talking art history or coffee making here. Your PhD is in?
I have a PhD in cybersecurity. Didn't exist when I got my PhD, and I'm not going to tell you when that was, but you could probably look me up and figure that out. But I got my PhD in accounting information systems, which was basically taking an auditor's approach to understanding how hackers get into accounting information in systems. And at that time, it was mostly focused on just internal networks because we didn't have the World Wide Web back then. But.
Thanks, Amy. Wael.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wael. I know everyone calls me Wael, but you can call me Wael, all works. So a bit of background about me. I'm an independent consultant. I'm on the consulting side of the business. So I'm going to be sharing my experience working with clients. My work is basically converge security from information security to logical security. I've been in the industry for 20 years now. My background is computer engineering. Ended up in security by chance. And I've been a hacker. Guilty.
Is that why you moved to Canada?
Yep. I've been in the hacking industry, so I know the ins and outs of hacking. I haven't pursued professional hacking, but I've been in that industry for a while. And working in the physical security industry for a while, I see and realize all the gaps. And this is why I decided to branch on my own and help clients in closing these gaps. So this is just in a brief. We're going to have a lot of discussions, so thank you very much for coming.
Wael. I've been mispronouncing your name all this time and you never corrected me.
That's fine. In Scotland, they call me Wael.
Wael, okay. I stand corrected. So here's our agenda this afternoon. We're going to start off by talking about common vulnerabilities. And then before we get into the spec, we need to discuss something very important, and that's the conversation to be had with IT so that you really understand what you're dealing with. For you guys, product selection, and then we'll segue into the UL standard because that's certainly a question and a consideration. Configuring products, what do you specify as a consultant for how those products are configured, as well as verification and testing. Talk about submittals. What about after the installation is complete? And then some resources. Now, I will say that the session immediately following this really is a close companion, and that is, look, we can spec until we're blue in the face. Contractor shall do this, contractor shall do that, and so on. But what's reasonable And what's that integrator capable of? And how do we fill that gap? And John, you're going to be on that panel, I believe, correct? And Andrew Lanning and Phil Aronson. So that's going to be a great panel as well. And it really does go hand in hand what we're talking about here, because that's the other side of the equation. We design it, toss it over the wall. They got to build it. So with that, Amy, would you please address this issue? Common vulnerabilities and kinds of things we need to worry about.
So the reason for talking about this, if we're going to have some standards, and I worked on the NIST cybersecurity framework, so any of the frameworks that exist should be referenced when we start to develop new frameworks. And these are sort of some common issues that you see in all security frameworks that need to be addressed. And I can go through each one of these one by one if you want, but the main point is that there are the same vulnerabilities in cameras and access controls that there are in all of the other systems that we use, in servers and computers and phones. And cameras we think of as being perimeter devices that keep everybody else out, but they're incredibly intelligent now. And anything with an IP address is kind of like my new friend Dean, who their cameras are incredibly gregarious and they're always looking to make new connections with new friends. And so hackers.
Your wife hears about that.
That's
Oh,
right.
you're safe then.
I was friends with Penny before I was friends with Dean, so we're good. So all of these vulnerabilities are because if you walk down the street with your phone is looking to make handshakes with any access point it can find, and cameras are kind of the same, and the bad guys know this. So they're looking for cameras with passwords that are manufacturer passwords. And if you enter a Google search for IP camera manufacturer passwords, you will get a complete list of probably every name brand camera plus the default password. And that's a helpful thing to help you connect your camera to your network, but it's also something that the hackers can find, and they can use that to get in if you don't reset your passwords. And it's the same for all of these. If you have to patch your computer, you have to patch your camera. And so anytime we put together standards for protecting any device that has an IP address, then these are some of the things that need to be included in it.
Thanks, Amy. So now we get into something that is also, I would say, you understand the vulnerability. You also need to understand the landscape that you're dealing with. What's that client have? What are his policies, procedures, and so forth? And that's what we're calling the IT conversation. So to address that, Wael, please come up and, because you've had a lot of experience in this stuff, I know.
Yeah. So the main thing is we're going to go back to the main topic, which is the language of cybersecurity in a spec, right? I know most of you are doing physical security. Anyone doing information security? Okay. Anyone else? No, just information security, cybersecurity. No. Okay. So this is where we need to delineate and draw the line between the responsibilities of the two sectors when you're specifying physical security equipment. They're overlapping. However, if you're not a subject matter expert in that field, there might be some liabilities on you if you're speccing full cybersecurity spec where you're not considering that as part of the overall program of your organization or your client's organization. So this is where it's very important to start the conversation with your IT, basically information security officer, IT security officers, and then look into what are the programs in place. Are they ISO company, ISO 27001? Do they have the NIST framework and the planning? Do they have any other programs that they're working on? This is where your spec needs to basically reflect what they're having and make sure the products you're putting in are part of that program, okay? Not even for when you're installing the system, but after the fact, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the road, okay?
While I suspect that you walk into clients, some of which probably have formal policies, procedures, how you provision passwords, all of this. Then you probably walk into some clients that are at the other end and have virtually nothing, and probably the majority fall somewhere between them where they're inadequate. So where they're inadequate or there's just a total absence, what do you do? How do you address that? And do you assume the whole burden of filling that gap or bringing other resources? How do you handle that?
Perfect. As a consultant, and as I'm providing both services, I offer both services as a converged approach. However, if they decided that they don't want me to do or get involved in the information security side, then this is where I draw the line. And you need the expertise, the right expertise, to know exactly what are the risks to you as a consultant and draw that line carefully so that it does not impact you when you go and spec a product. Because that's going to impact your insurance, your cyber liability insurance, and once you spec 5 years down the road, so that they don't come back and sue you for anything. Okay? So it's very critical. You know where to define that line. And if you're not the subject matter expert, please bring in someone with you who has the experience in the industry. Because just learning it right off the bat, it's not going to help. There's a lot of details in cybersecurity. Okay?
Yeah, and to your last point, I know in talking with Phil Aronson, Phil is on the next panel, that he actually prices that, that service in there. And if somebody does not want to pay for that, he makes them sign off, so he relieves himself of the liability to do that. And I think that's a great idea, and there's maybe some of that can occur within the consulting as well. If you don't want me to do that or get the people to do, don't hold me responsible. The other thing I would say is this, and maybe we can come back to this later on, is that once you develop, language or specification, you might want to pass that by the client's IT department, such as it is. You say, what have I missed? What's inconsistent, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It has to start the conversation from the beginning. So the initial conversation is very important because that's not going to only impact your spec. That's going to impact the product you select, the architecture, the products, the details of the products, the configurations, the submittals, all the process from your specification down to delivering the solution. Not only that, it's going to impact your maintenance agreement, reviewing maintenance agreements, and after the fact. So who's responsible for what is and with whom you establish that is very important task to accomplish.
I'm not going to let you off the hook right now, okay? So you just relax. We'll get to Jeff next here. We've got a few things on this list, right? One of my favorites is passwords. And I think everybody in this room understands the issue with passwords. Let's say you got an 800 camera deployment. Tech goes out there, and what's the password provisioning policy? And I know you're going to address that in the next session, Andrew, at least, and John, you are too. But does the client have something in place they have to comply with? Does he not? Is he reliant on the security integrator? Has he disavowed the security network where he wants nothing to do with it, and you're up to your own, and the integrator just picks one password and provisions across all cameras, the same as his last customer? It's all over the map. So, that's my personal favorite. So, talking about that password provisioning policy, but I've got a couple of other things on that list here. Maybe you care to comment those: asset management, licenses, certificates, and so forth. Pick your favorite.
Well, I'm going to start with the passwords because you picked that first,
okay.
And then I'm going to tell you my personal favorite. So the first thing about the passwords, we all know by now that weak passwords are a common vulnerability, that we need to address that. And I've been addressing that for the past 5 years. We've done government projects. We basically put in the passwords and mentioned that clearly in the spec. But when it comes to when it comes to the integrator to basically implement that, that's where the challenge becomes a fact. So yeah, you might have the first 100 cameras or 100 devices with the right password. Now go and check the other 500 cameras. They're going to have the default username and password. Okay. So on that note, the other favorite topic I have was basically integrators coming in and saying, well, we are segregating the cameras in a VLAN. That's fine. That's great. Nothing wrong with that. when you look into the configuration and if you don't have the right expertise, what you might notice is that these VLANs can be really bypassed. So you're basically providing a false sense of security to your end user, especially if someone comes in with a default configuration on the switches with dynamic trunking protocol and automatic configuration. And now I come in and I can basically truncate all these VLANs and monitor them on one network. So basically the VLAN approach now is no longer a secure VLAN.
So it's a precursor to any spec language. Again, getting back to my earlier point, you need to understand your landscape, the limitations of the client, your own limitations,
Absolutely.
right? And be able to bring together the right resources and then to get that feedback. And we'll come back and talk about submittals in a little bit.
Yep.
So, but that conversation is critically important right from the get-go, and you can't not have it and really hope to have a complete, valid cyber spec. Yeah, Dean.
I'm more on the physical side, you know that. Our industry changes, but as a snail's pace compared to the IT side.
Yep.
We spent a lot of our lives watching Adobe Acrobat update. When you engage on an IT side, is there a recurring component of your services checking up? I don't know if you want to call it a maintenance agreement or whatever, because of that dynamic nature. You don't just design a system and drive away.
No.
Can you talk to that about how you structure your business for recurring revenue?
So let me repeat the question.
Sure.
So as you, and I'll sort of paraphrase because I can't say it as eloquently as you, Dean. As you engage with a client, because the technology and threats are not static, do you have a recurring component, pricing component, contractual component, to keeping that client up to date as you go along? Is that an important part of your business?
Absolutely. This is a very important part, especially because I'm doing converged security most of my applications with clients. So cybersecurity is not a one-time program or one-time service. And I get a lot of clients that think we can establish a cybersecurity program in 1 week or 2 weeks. And I tell them, there's no way. I set their expectations from day one. It's minimum to start the wheel moving is going to take you 6 months minimum to start establishing the proper procedures, the policies, and get the culture in that environment ready for the cybersecurity mentality. So it's not a one-time off, no, not at all. And even when we look into the physical security pieces, it's not a one-time installation. You set it up and you have the integrator coming in and then he leaves. Again, I mentioned the maintenance program is very important. Cybersecurity needs to be built in every single step of that process, from the consulting piece to the specification, to the installation, commissioning and testing, and then the maintenance piece and after the fact, and even the decommissioning piece, the whole life cycle of that solution.
Okay. I'll let you off the hook now, Wael.
All right.
Thank you.
Great.
Actually, Ray, if I may, so in the spirit of why we're here, and I know that one of the challenges that we've had is I look at the IT conversation and I'm immediately going to the nerd side of what we're trying to do. So I look at some of the things that are out here, and realizing first of all that you need to find the right person. You need to have the right conversation with the personnel inside of the organization. Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not. But in doing all of that, when you start looking at the ground rules and the questions I would have is, how much risk are you willing to take on? What's your, what are your business functions? We've kind of had some of these conversations already today. But really it's to mold the thou shalts and the thou wilts around what is really necessary and what the customer is really trying to do or what you are trying to present to that particular organization. So when I look through this, we look at the licenses and now we start asking the technical questions in the specification. What do you want to do with those licenses? Where do you want to store that? We have where are we going to store the backups? How are we going to secure those? What are we going to do about data remnants? When you look at the certificates, you're talking to the client. Do you have your own? Are you self-signed? Are you going to use a customer's? Do we have a relationship? Are we going to use Active Directory? So, these are, I'm trying to get little pieces to say that these are the pieces that as a consultant, I want to have in my security policy as I push that forward. And the challenge I have is we really want to kind of make you aware of that. The challenge I have as a manufacturer is I'll come to you and say, well, yeah, I can do 8021X and I can do certificates and I can do TLS and I can do all the really cool things that are necessary inside of your network. Because I'm not driving this now. It is someone else at a higher level that is telling me these are the controls that I want in place. This is how we are going to communicate. And then this is the policy that I'm going to put together. So as I look through this, that's kind of what's going through my head as I'm trying to put something, and back to what Ray has published, trying to put lines in there or things to make you think of what can I say? You will do this or you will do that because this is what my customer wants. And then as you go forward, you can say, okay, here's my handoff list. Mr. Customer, you've decided not to do this or you want to do that. These are the pieces that are in place. This is what we have implemented. This is the policy that aligns with what your company profile is. And this is what you have to do to continually maintain that going forward.
And for me, align with what your company profile is. I think it
Exactly.
makes all the sense in the world when you walk in with your initial sort of documentation and plan that how that's going to plug into what they have, because you may think one thing, but they may have a policy in another direction.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I thank you for that.
So I would like just to add one very important piece which I missed in the beginning is when we engage with IT or the information security, we look into the information and physical security program in a holistic approach, and we look into the cybersecurity and the tiers that this establishment or organization or the client is at when we engage with them. So if, let's say, they are a tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3, we understand at that tier, what's their capability and maturity at that level? Where are they today? Where are they? What's their plans for the next year or 2 years or 3 years, so that we know what we need to engage with them and what are the products that we need to spec with them that are compatible with their programs and their future plans or strategic plans in the information security work.
Good. Sure, Amy.
So another thing that I just wanted to add, when we go in to talk to a cybersecurity client, the first thing we do is we start asking questions. So what are you concerned about? What policies do you have? Is there some sort of legislation that you have to be compliant with? Are there regulations that you need to be compliant with? And I'm new to talking to physical security consultants, but I'm always looking for ways to bridge a knowledge gap. And this is really so much of, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot that you can get from the IT staff in the clients that you're working with. And also you can start asking questions of the manufacturers and the integrators that you work with to find out what their best practices are. And I think that security consultants are ideally positioned to be the leaders in this because you're the information gatherers. So you can collect, I would suggest that you collect information from the IT staff of the clients that you work with, from the physical security staff that you work with, and then also from the manufacturers and from the integrators, and then also look at some of the existing compliance that maybe the legislation that your clients need to be compliant with, like do they need to be HIPAA compliant? Do they need to be PCI compliant? And that's not going to directly relate to cameras because there isn't sensitive information necessarily you don't have social security numbers on cameras, but you can use the same principles of the regulations that your clients currently have to be compliant with in locking down the same elements that exist in the physical security devices. So just to summarize, I think, ask lots of questions, start making your own lists, and you'll come up with the answers to lead in your own.
Yeah, Jim.
Well, personally, I think there's a lot of us here that really don't know what questions to ask.
No, I think that's fair. I think that's probably characteristic of a lot of the audience that's here at the event.
I mean, I can get into the basics, but that's where I stop. And so I like to rely on standards to help me through that process. And the standards are, in my view, 3 pieces. One is in the manufacturing standard, which is...
Jim, let me hold you for a second. Would you pass Jim a mic, please?
Yeah, one is a manufacturing standard. You know, what should I include for the different risks associated with the place, and the second is the integrator standard. What should certifications, you know me and certifications, I should have for the integrator who's installing it. And finally, a certification for the installation. Like UL has a standard certification for fire alarm systems and different classes and things like that. And what I'd like to see is some development of that. So, you know, the questions are already there and have already been answered.
Well, I think you said something, Jim, very important, and you're an important point. When your expert, basically what you said was when your expertise isn't up there, you fall back on standards. I would argue that is inadequate because, you know, there's a lot of standards. Some are even in conflict. You know, I think you have to understand what your limitations are and complement your expertise with the right resources, number one. Understand what you're trying to plug into, and don't use the standards as a necessarily as a fallback or a crunch, because, you know, that's, in a way, you're not getting into the real requirement of the installation. I would also say, and we're going to touch on that point again here a little bit, if we can just.
Can I just argue with you a little bit on that? I absolutely agree with you that it's inadequate and often sometimes misleading, and there are conflicting standards. But if your head is spinning and you don't know where to begin, it's a great starting point.
Yeah, but it's not. But you can't rely on it in total, Amy.
No, absolutely not.
You have to place those in context.
We have to start somewhere.
Well, yeah, that's a good baseline.
Yeah.
And we could write cyber spec language that says, oh, just refer to these standards and leave these guys at sea. And guess what? With the current level of expertise among a lot of people, they're not going to understand all those things the standards say.
Couldn't agree more, but I do feel like there are a lot of people that have no idea where to begin.
I'm not throwing them out the window. I'm just saying you just can't say, oh yeah, just go to the standard, be done with it. You can't do that.
When I go to UL, when I go to UL and say a door shall meet a certain listing, I don't subject the door to 1,000-degree blow flame on one side. I mean, I rely on that standard and the manufacturer of that standard and the guy who 5 people touch that door and the qualifications that manufacturer has and his certification on products. I'm not saying standards for everything, but and I can probably guess at some of the standards and.
Okay, so let me hold you for a second, because that leads into, and Neil, I'm going to hold you for a second too.
Yes, sure.
Because it really leads us into, look, we're first and foremost security consultants, right? So understand what you're trying to protect. And so you mentioned a door, all right? It might be a camera, it might be something else. You've got to go through some product selection, right? So from a cyber standpoint, how do I make the determination of what products are going to help me meet not just the physical security requirements, but will be likely to be cyber compliant? So I'm going to, because I want you to come back next and talk about you.
I want to know it.
Okay. Okay. That will meet. That's right. I shouldn't have plugged that word in there. So Jeff, I would say, these guys, what would you suggest? No, I'm not anti-UL. You're gonna get your airtime. Trust me, Neil. But so what should this group look for when picking out products? These are some of the things that we've listed. Maybe there are others, but talk about that for a second.
Well, I think that there's a couple of things that really encompass this conversation, and it's. The first thing is when you look at the company or the products that you want to specify. And we can talk about hardening guides, which a lot of the manufacturers have that. We have it as well. It's general practices. We have different levels. We say, hey, if you want this, if you want that. But sometimes that may only make sense. And even some of the tools that we provide as an organization only make sense if you're working inside of that manufacturer's ecosystem. It doesn't really make sense, or maybe the policies that we are recommending, which is our best practices, which has to do with our products, may not make sense in the bigger picture, but it's a start. So as you look through those, we have a lot of recommendations for how to harden certain things depending on the atmosphere that you're driving at the bigger end. I think the challenge in some of this is not necessarily anything that's wrapped around product per se. It's really what the reputation of the company is going to be. And I know when you look at the software development process, I know as an organization, we have a lot of very high line initiatives that we're running. We just went into the GDPR. We're looking at ISO 27001. All of those have very strict policies on how you act as an organization and what they expect from you from a development process inside of your products that you bring to market. And it's a very large process, but I think the definition there is what's important, and I know that's the things that we are pushing forward to the market is do you feel comfortable with what the manufacturer is doing to help you manage the vulnerabilities long term inside of our products that are beyond your network. So I know that a lot of sites have, and I'll talk specifically about us. So if I say us, I kind of mean us as manufacturers. But I know that we have very defined processes. We're actually in very strict alignments with BSIMM or HH or something like that. Essentially it's an organization that has very high regulations for how we develop software and firmware and how we deploy that. So we're part of that organization. We also have a common vulnerability website. We hide nothing, so you can see what is out there, what we are doing as an organization or what a company is doing as an organization to address certain vulnerabilities. The thing to remember though is don't get caught up in the whole vulnerability and oh my gosh, my network's gonna crash. Understand that vulnerabilities are found every day. It's just the way that the world works. So the reality is what you have to worry about is what can I do with a vulnerability or a set of vulnerabilities that will actually turn into an exploit that then turns into risk, right? So those are the things you have to be concerned about. So for us as an organization, for a lot of manufacturers, we're very open to that process. And I think it's really incumbent on you to make sure that process is in place, because that gets pushed down to the way that the contractor works with us, the way that we deploy systems, and the way that we manage that long term. The other thing, and I just wanted to note, something that is more of a question to you than it is a broad statement, but the question I have is when you look at larger deployments, one of the challenges that we have as an organization, and anyone does, is you have to be really careful with firmware. We have no idea from the time that the product leaves the line, gets into the truck and comes over on the boat and goes into here and goes into there. By the time that process happens, though today it's ungodly fast, it is possible that firmware changes from point A to point B. So the question I have, and some of the larger integrators actually have mock sites, a couple of them are ISO 9001 certified, where they will actually bring product in, they will test it, they will harden it before it even touches a customer's facility. So my question to you all is either in the short term as a requirement from the contractor or as a conversation with the end user to say, what are you doing? Do you really want to take a product right off of the shelf, plug it into your network, and then apply all the security settings? Because guess what? If there's something in there or something's happened, I already got you, right? Exactly, right. So it's just something to think about. That it's a conversation that as a consultant you can have with them to say, listen, this is a very real problem that we have. What do you want to do about it? Do you want to just accept the risk? You don't care? Do you want to set up your own testing facility for long term? Do you want the contractor to do it? There's a lot of conversations, and it's something you can write to say, this is the way it is going to be. And everyone is on the same page. Everyone agrees to the way that they're going to do it.
In other words, in the execution section of the spec, one could say, contractors shall install product with latest firmware upgrades, patches, for whatever it is. That's something that's specable,
exactly.
Is it not?
That's exactly.
And it's the firmware, and it's the no device shall touch the network without having the X number of controls implemented. There's a lot of different things. It just depends on what the customer wants to do. But in today's world, a lot of things happen, and it's validating. You also have to be very careful with validating firmware to make sure that the firmware is really the right firmware that goes on the camera, right? So all of these things, I don't think you'd want to be doing that live. You'd want to do it off-site. You want to do somewhere, you test it, make sure everything's okay, and then you plug it onto the network, because that will drastically reduce the amount of pain that could be inflicted.
So now we're not just looking at protocols on a data sheet. You're looking at the manufacturer's processes. You're looking at the manufacturer himself. I mean, you're really almost trusting the manufacturer to endow that with a certain product. Now, part of this is the software development process, and that gets into the UL requirements. I'm going to ask Neil, I'd like you to come up and address that if you would please, because, and your question, Jim, about standards. So UL is not known for a cyber standard, right? But I think, you're in the game now. And so why did you guys develop a standard? Let's take us through that.
Yeah, so let me start, and just disclaimer, I'm not a cybersecurity expert. I've been in this field for about 2.5 years, and I'll share with you what I learned. There is no panacea to cybersecurity, right? It's so very dynamic. So while we might have codes and standards for physical products and be able to evaluate performance and reliability, because of the nature of cybersecurity, there's no silver bullet. And so, because there's so many people involved in it. And so I would argue that it's more about the people and process part of it than it is the tech. The tech is getting there, I think. It still has a way to go, but it's getting there. But the way we started with this is that UL, our mission is promoting safe living and working environments for people. And so we develop standards, we provide testing, inspection, and certification services towards that mission. And one of the big questions we ask is, how relevant are we in the markets that we serve? And so we identified cyber across a variety of different verticals as a growing risk, as a growing issue. And so that was part of the thrust that got us into developing standards, let alone, some of our clients in other industries asked us to start doing it. Because, if we're doing performance, reliability, safety for products, why are we ignoring cybersecurity? So that was the big question. And so we took a shot a couple years ago with the industry, government, manufacturers, other stakeholders to develop a general requirements document for cybersecurity. So what we did is we went out and we looked across all the different cybersecurity frameworks and standards, guidelines that existed out there. NIST was one of the big ones that was being followed at the time. And one of the things that we identified that was a gap was that none of the requirements are really testable. And so that's what we developed, is a testable method to evaluate a product or a system for cybersecurity. And it's a lot of the really basic blocking and tackling, we believe, for products and for systems. And so really the scope of the standard is really just to be able to elevate the cyber posture of a product or a system, and to provide a reasonable level of assurance that there's an absence of vulnerabilities, software weaknesses, and that there's risk controls that are present on that product. So I'll underline the word reasonable, because again, there is no such thing as zero risk. Nobody knows about 0 days. It's a 0 day, so nobody knows about it. So there's always going to be things that will come up and surface in the future, and it's such a dynamic environment. So you can in no way kind of equate this to product standards or physical hardware. It's a much different animal. So that's probably the biggest learning that we have. We went to market with this standard to offer testing, advisory, training, and certification services. And frankly, most people are not ready for certification. That's more of a goal. Most of the work that we've been doing with the industries that we serve, including life safety and security industry, has been on training and advisory and doing gap analysis and doing testing. And there's actually only one product in the life safety and security industry that has a certification. It's the Johnson Controls network video recorder. Only one. So after about 1.5 years, 2 years, there's only one product. So that's out on the market. And it's because they had a really head start, I think, on cybersecurity. They had implemented and invested in cybersecurity years before we ever got involved, and it paid off for them. So
Neil, let me, as I look at this, it's embedded software firmware, right? That's
correct.
That's what you guys are focused on.
That's correct. So here's the outline of the standard. You get a sense of the different areas that we cover. So risk controls, looking at authentication, access control. This addresses your default password issues, how you're handling remote communication. Is data in transit protected? How you're handling software patches and updates for your clients. So those are all part of the risk controls and risk management. And then you get into the vulnerability. So there's multiple published vulnerability databases So that's a pretty straightforward one that you would want to evaluate a product software for these known vulnerabilities that are out there.
So I think you'll admit, though, there are third-party testing services. I know, Software House, part of Johnson Controls, uses third-party vulnerability testing. Linnell does the same thing. A lot of other manufacturers do the same thing. So if you've got very competent organizations who've been in this business for a long time, what's different about UL? And I think you can say that UL is not the only game in town, obviously, because you've got these other. So what's different about UL, and why should people rely on that standard versus independent third-party testing that's robust?
Yeah, I think it depends on where they are in the maturity cycle. So if they're just getting started with cybersecurity and they need training, they need advisory, those are things that we can do. When they get to a point where they've developed the capability and a competence, they may be able to do that in-house. In fact, a lot of what we do, our biggest competition is in-house, companies that do their own in-house testing. So it's really competitive in the space of penetration testing. Many companies out there, third-party, many manufacturers are able to do a lot of their own penetration testing, different software tools that they have to do that. But if you're...
Excuse me, you say do their own, but most good manufacturers will not do their own. They'll subcontract or they'll go to an independent third party to do it because those third parties really understand the technology, the latest vulnerabilities. They've got the full suite of hacking tools. They're far beyond what these manufacturers, for the most part in this industry, can do. And Jeff, for your firm, do you guys do that? I think most other major firms have third-party testing agencies that they will work with. Is that right?
We don't necessarily use third party. It's we use industry standards, and they are pre-developed. So we would rather, Access has always been very much standards driven. So rather than farming things out, we have our internal QA processes and part of our engineering firm where we do all the testing according to what the standards that have been put out there. So we don't really third party anything.
Okay. Well, what's your view of third party? And we'll come back to the UL discussion, but it sounds like you want to weigh in on this.
So I'm just going to add one important point. Is that pen testing or doing the UL certification is all good. However, from a cybersecurity perspective, it's very important for all the consultants to realize that it's not a one-time thing. So even if they do the pen testing, whether third party or not, that doesn't mean that the device is not going to be vulnerable in the future. So it's not a one-time thing.
So let me ask you.
Yep.
So you're at the front end. You gotta either specify some products, a class of products, a manufacturer's product. As a consultant, what do you look for in the manufacturer and in the product?
Perfect.
What's in your head?
First of all, we look into the software development life cycle and the processes in place for the manufacturers.
How do you do that?
We ask for their certification if they have an information security program in place, and we look into specifically for the software development life cycle if they are taking the right processes to place. So we ask this question.
Do you care if it's internal or third party? Do you
Absolutely. I mean, everyone can vouch for their own. We ask for third party validation. There are certifications in the market like the ISO 27001, although just want to caution that the ISO 27001 can be an overall blanket. It could be just for an accounting division. So you need to ask the right question. Is it for the software development of that product, of that firmware for that product?
So third party then is easy. You get a certificate. But what if a company does, like Jeff's company, have a well-developed internal process? They're following the standards, procedures. Can you be convinced that that's adequate if they show you the right stuff?
Again, cybersecurity is not a one-piece approach to the whole solution.
I understand.
So if I'm not convinced, I look into a program for my client to make sure this product, when it's on their network or in their enterprise, we have other controls in place to make sure that if, let's say, whether it's already validated, it's already tested, there's no issues, or in the future, if there's any potential vulnerabilities. A lot of the manufacturers use nowadays open source platform or code that is available. And every day we're finding new vulnerabilities in these code. So basically having the right controls in place and the program within the client's organization is very important.
But theoretically, you could, if the manufacturer showed you what they were doing, with all the right stuff, that could pass muster with you. Is that right?
It could pass muster to a certain point. And again, that's where you define the line with your client in terms of responsibilities, in terms of what's your role as a consultant, what you're providing to them, and where your liability will end.
So these guys are information security consultants as you are. So what advice would you give to them in terms of how they would validate? I mean, you could go to UL, but there's only one product in the world that does that. So, there's a lot of other products out there and manufacturers. What would your advice to them to take a conservative approach to make sure that they were speccing something that was pretty okay?
Again, the specing of the product needs to align, one, with the information security program of the client and their maturity in that program, where they stand, where they're going to be their strategic approach to it for the next steps. That's one. The next step is having the right subject matter expert with you to help in basically specifying the right product that fits within that program.
So you get some expertise to help evaluate and assure that manufacturer was one that had proper processes, procedures.
Not specifically for the manufacturer side, but the solution, the overall solution they're putting in.
Okay, but it does come down to manufacturers at some point, right? Who are components of that, and each one should be compliant. So
to a certain extent, again, it's not the end-all solution. My argument to that is that we look into a one camera or any device from a physical security perspective, but we all use Cisco switches or any other switches that are being shipped from other countries, right? And we don't look into that. When we spec it, in most of the cases, anyone spec the switch with basically asking the manufacturer to provide a certificate? Anyone?
That was my next question, is that, okay, if I say independent testing, then I completely eliminated the largest supplier of cameras on the planet.
who very well is probably doing a really good
Yeah,
job, right? But he's got to convince you.
But when Wael or somebody comes up and says, "Well, we're independently tested," I got to say, "Okay, well, you're cool," and I know it depends on the testing protocol and what you do. And
Let's give Jim a mic, please.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Maybe
Now you did it.
Permanent mic.
We try not to.
I mean, I'm concerned as a specifier of this stuff, is that I rely on third-party testing. What should be that testing, and can I do it? If I got an 8,000 camera system, that's one thing, and I can say that, and they're all the M-series Axis Dome cameras. I can say I want a third-party test, and either you or the integrator will pay for that. And that's okay with me, as long as I know it. So I think independent testing has always been a good thing to do. But my question is, who pays for that, and what should we specify?
I'll answer your question. So again, going back to specifying a product, even if you get the certification or validation of a pen test that this product is bulletproof, right, at a certain point. Now, my question or my counter argument to you is, what if the manufacturer or the integrator comes in and changes one setting? Now,
well, I'm going to stop you there because I do want to move into product configuration. I'm just saying, and Jim, you're asking the same thing. How do I pick a manufacturer I can be comfortable with? Yeah. Right?
And remember, I said there were 3 or 4 pieces to this. And the first one is the product that you specify.
Correct.
And if that product has been tested by an independent testing, you can name those testing agencies and define the test that they're supposed to qualify for. My question is if the manufacturer's not doing it, should I? Should I specify that test be done?
I don't believe that you should specify the test to be done on that product. If you have a third-party validation from the manufacturer, that will give you a bit of an assurance that this product has been tested. However, my advice to you is basically do not take this assurance as the end-all solution, because the next time you install a firmware, there's no guarantees. This test is no longer valid because the firmware can invalidate this test.
It's time sensitive. So, I kind of want to close this chapter of the the discussion So I think the important point is that, the consultant has to understand, whether it's yourself or yourself plus a team, that there's a verifiable development process in place, testing process by that manufacturer, whether it be a well-known organization, a third-party organization, or even internal, if that's in place, that there's got to be a satisfaction that those things are being done right. I think that's the underlying message here. We could debate which one is better and how it gets done, but that's really the point there. Now we get into the next point.
Can I just add something really quickly?
Really quickly, because I got to move on.
Okay. I just want to say that there's always multiple ways to do things. And one of the things that you can do is if you have a fairly small network or a really large network, instead of depending on a particular manufacturer to do what you need for them to do, you can partner with someone who can put a data gathering engine on the network and deploy agents on the devices and look for vulnerabilities across the devices. And there are lots of different options out there for
and
that.
We're going to touch on the verification and testing, Amy, but these guys have to specify product.
Right,
I mean,
but
what's going to go in there in the first place?
Right, but
right?
you don't
want to find out about it after the fact, necessarily.
Well, there's going to be vulnerabilities on every single device on the network.
Once it's deployed.
Every single one. It doesn't matter what the manufacturer
So that brings me
is.
to the next point here. And Jeff, I want you to tackle that. So now, product gets rolled out, and you sort of hit on that earlier, and now it's being installed. What should these guys say, being primarily consultant guys, about what that contractor should do in terms of secure configuration of that product? So on that day, that timestamp, on that day that the thing is secure as it can be on that day, what kinds of things do we think about there? Jeff.
I think he just threw me a hardball there.
It's valid because we're talking about spec language here, and we've got to layer some requirements on the integrators to do things as they're installing that product to make sure this thing is going to be a secure installation. What kinds of things would you recommend?
Well, so I think it goes back to finding out what the desire of the customer is going to be. And when you look at what controls that they've implemented, because again, when you look at a product, and I'm going to go all the way down to the product, as you look at a system, we are just one piece, right? So you'll have multiple facets to your entire security operation. So the question really is, for us, is that we're capable of doing multiple things inside of our product. We have our own tools that will allow you to apply certificates and manage firmware and do all the other stuff that could be part of what you as a consultant is requiring from the end or from the contractor. And then is something that will turn into either maintenance that the contractor provides or maintenance that the customer is signed off to do. So when you look at all of that, we really, what I'm finding in all of this, and one of the reasons why I'm trying to kind of step a little bit away from helping drive the spec language is because our products specifically are just one piece of the bigger puzzle. So my question to you is what exactly is it that you are trying to do? Now, there are little things that we can do. We have hardening guides and we have different policies that we can implement. We have pieces of software that allow you to secure your network. Do you want to have on-site testing and validation before you go onto a network? Do you want to do the contractor? So there are a lot of those questions that can be asked up front to make sure that the contractor understands exactly what it is and kind of draws a line of demarc between when the project is done and then whomever, whether it's the contractor or the end user, will then take over responsibility of that particular system. So
let's start with this guy over here. You think you have an answer to that question?
Absolutely. So basically, when we're looking into a converged approach, we assume the risk or the risk management process for the client. So we look into the security risks, and we specify accordingly. So this is where, when we had the discussion with Ray on the spec, it's very important to understand that this is not a one-time spec that you just plug in for different projects. Depends on your engagement with the client. So, for example, if I'm engaged on an information and physical security approach, looking into the security risk for the client, my specs is going to be customized to that approach, okay? From the selection of the product to the installation requirements, the deliverables, and the closeout for the project. So it's very important to have this discussion that this spec is not like a template that you can copy and paste across for a cybersecurity approach. Okay, so again, it depends on how much the client is willing to invest. What's the risk, first of all, and is it worth investing in that area, right? Do we need an actually 802.1x implementation if the client doesn't have the infrastructure or the support to basically implement that? So all these needs to be taken into consideration before putting out the spec.
Well, if I were writing a spec, and I don't write specs, I don't compete with these guys, they do it much better than I would do it anyway. You know, I would want to have some reasonable certainty, while that when that product went in, that contractor installed it, that it was pretty buttoned down, as buttoned down as it could be. You know, that, you know, right ports were open, the wrong ports were closed, that, you know, patches were done, that there are a number of basic things that can be done. You know, it's not the be all and the end all, and things change, but on that day, when that job is signed over, it should be as buttoned down as it can be, shouldn't it? I mean, that's reasonable.
To a certain point, yes.
Question back here.
Yeah.
Just wait for the mic here, Jim.
Yeah, I wanted to dovetail on what you said. So I'm a consultant, and the approach that we've taken, I know it seems a little overly.
Jim, just hold on a second, because we're trying to capture it for the video too.
So the approach that we've taken to start with, because we're struggling like a lot of consultants to figure out how far do we go, is we've required two things at this point in our specifications for the integrators. The first one is during the initial submittal phase of a project, they have to submit to us a cybersecurity hardening guideline that they plan to use on that project for the products that they're going to deliver. Now, some manufacturers already have that guideline, others don't, and so it's up to the integrator to develop that guideline. At least we know they're addressing it, and then that guideline can get in front of our client and their IT department, and then it starts the conversation, because their IT department might see things missing on that list. Hey, how come you're not doing this or that? Or they might see, hey, you're configuring it this way. We don't agree with that. Then the second thing we require at project closeout is that they produce a similar document, which is they have to provide a cybersecurity ongoing, I forget the term that we use for it, but it's essentially another checklist or another guideline. How do you plan to maintain cybersecurity for this installation? Now, if the contractor doesn't have a service agreement, the nice thing is that gets handed back to the IT department, and now they know that, hey, I have all this product in my building that's on my network, and the integrator's already told me these are the things, firmware upgrades and patches and that sort of thing.
Jim, I think those are excellent points. I really do, because you've got the day one going into it, and then you got the end day, if there is an end day, where that network is and that equipment that you're responsible for is buttoned down, and then you're giving some guidance, or the contractor is, for moving forward, right? And Amy, I'm gonna, so let's go on that moving forward piece, because the ongoing. So what do you think is possible to spec in terms of that ongoing program? And Jim, you said it great. There's not always a service agreement in place. If there is, that's an answer. The burden's on the integrator. If there isn't, the burden's back not on the consultant but on the end user. But I think the consultant can be really helpful in this regard. And so, what kinds of recommendations might you have for things to think about moving forward?
I absolutely agree that was an excellent point, and I think that one of the things to consider is that you have an organized approach. And I would say that being organized is more important than being organized in a particular way, because again, this can be incredibly overwhelming. Cybersecurity can be incredibly overwhelming. So to just have a model, any model that's out there that you can adopt for thinking about security will be a good starting point, and it will keep you from missing things. Just to be organized, the beginning, the middle, and the end. And a very simple, easy starting point, if you don't already have one, is that in cybersecurity, generally what we think about is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we think about those things in terms of accounting records. So is someone's salary confidential? Is an order for 100 widgets protected so that it's not changed to an order for 10,000 widgets? And is the data available to the decision makers when they need to make it on an accounting thing? Now you can think of cameras the same way. So for confidentiality is the feed of some sensitive information in your company from that camera in some sensitive place. Is that feed available to someone who's not authorized to see that feed? So there's confidentiality. There's the integrity. Is it possible for someone to use the manufacturer's password on the camera to change it so that the image that has the person in it who's about to walk into your building to steal stuff is changed to an image that doesn't have the person in it? So that's an integrity issue. And then the availability is, have you protected the data so that it's there whenever you need to review it for your security and safety needs? So just those 3 words are a really good starting point for organizing the way that you think about. And you can apply that to any device in any setting and just think through, how is a camera vulnerable? How is an access control vulnerable? And that's a good starting point.
The specification piece.
Ray, if I could add on to what Amy talked about, if you're looking for an easy button for cybersecurity, it doesn't exist, right? And that's kind of what I'm hearing in the back of my mind is that, right, it just doesn't exist. And so I guess if I was a consultant in this industry, I'd be looking to compartmentalize my risk. And so there's things that you're going to be able to control, and there's things that you're not going to be able to control. And maybe the spec is a contract, with your client that says, I'm going to do these things for you. I'm going to do my due diligence. And that could be, I'm going to ask the manufacturer of a product or a system, all these different questions, verify this information. And on the other side, you're setting an expectation that, okay, well, the end user is going to do these things, right? So cyber is absolutely a shared responsibility. It's not one entity's complete responsibility. It's the whole value chain. And so I think you guys are a prominent part of the value chain for security. I think maybe the spec is defined, what are the guardrails for your profession? And what you should be responsible for, what you think you can control, and it's really about putting the risk where it belongs.
Well, there's a feedback loop in this, right? Because I think you got to go back and ask, simply stated, is this okay? Is this compliant? Is this going to work it? Are you satisfied with this? What, where are the holes? Is that ongoing conversation? So I just want to hit on a couple of things here. We've got some.
Can I address just that question just quickly?
Okay.
So this is a very good point, and that's where the IT conversation at the beginning needs to happen.
Right.
But what we see from a practical point of view is that we see some consultants, not addressing anyone specifically, but sending the requirements. And now when you see IT is basically more ahead of the game from the physical security side, now the client ends up with 2 different documents or 2 different approaches to maintaining the products in place. And this is where the disconnect happens between the physical and logical security. This is why it's very important to have this conversation from the beginning with the information security guys so that you have a unified program into play and avoid all these gaps from the get-go.
And Jim, for a guy like you and many others in this room, I'd say, okay, where's the other resource that when I need it, I can bring in to sort of round out my team? And we have teaming arrangements in this business all the time. Want to hit on a couple of last things. Here's some ideas on submittals.
Ray,
I'm sorry.
one of the things that you can require in the specifications is that the integrator have an SME on board, so that they would be the interface between the consultant and the IT group, making sure that the product and the in-network meets the criteria that the company is looking for.
What if the integrator has been chosen yet, Norm?
All the more reason to require it.
That's all the more reason to require it. You need to have somebody.
Does that mean that guy is going to make up for a deficient spec?
No. What he's going to do is he's going to interpret what the spec says. You're going to try to do the spec to meet the guidelines,
Right.
minimum requirements. And then his job is to make sure that meets the criteria. And then if there's an issue, he's the one who's going to be responsible to contact the consultant and the IT group in order to be able to work things out.
Okay, and that makes sense. I think that's going to touch on in the next section. The technically competent integrator. But I think as a starting point, wouldn't you agree that producing a reasonable spec out of the gate that people work with is a very desirable
very much so, but you also have to remember a lot of the standards out there.
Hold on.
is- A lot of
Neil, just turn around, let him finish, then pass the mic over to Ed if you would,
Oh, I
please.
thought you still had mine. There you go. That's all right.
you have to understand that a lot of the standards, such as the NIST standards, are minimum requirements. And that doesn't guarantee that if you end up in a lawsuit that you're going to be protected because you met the minimum requirements.
Right.
Oftentimes you have to show due diligence showing that you exceeded the minimum requirements.
And I would agree with you that on that implementation, right, that maybe you missed something. Maybe the integrator is going to see something. Having that person, look, it helps to have a proper cyber resource at every, sort of at every juncture. And Ed, I know you'd like to add to that, please.
Actually, this is a slightly different cut, and
Okay.
I'll make it short because I know you're out of time. But how many different times do we see situations where an end client or an integrator says, hey, I'm not installing the latest version of software because I always want to let it settle out, and they're going to do patches, they're going to do this. And because of the fast-moving nature of cybersecurity, all the things that need to be fixed that are in there that the manufacturers are helping us with and putting in there are always in the next generation of software. So we as a collective group need and want to incentivize those manufacturers that put the effort into not only doing the cyber things that we're talking about today, but doing the other things that allow us to use the products that they put the cyber things into.
Ed is always a great perspective. We've got about just a minute left here. So, and we'll share these slides with you. Here are some resources and links. But I also want to say, look, as a result of this, what are we going to do? And we've got some, version 1.1 sort of model spec language out there, and it's not adequate. We, security specifiers, with help from my friends throughout, we'll try to update that. I think as a result of what I heard today, I think manufacturer selection criteria that people can agree to and some guidelines there will probably be a very good thing to do. I'd like all of you who are here who are interested in this language, send me an email with a checklist of some of those things that maybe it's not in CSI format, but maybe we can develop almost an index of something that would tie some model spec language into it that you can cut and paste into it. Other guidances. My goal is to get beyond that. A lot of this stuff is very good. The stuff you can use. And you know what? And it's an ongoing process, isn't it? There's a lot to think about. You've got a lot of perspective, but we got to start somewhere. Look, we got liability. We're specing stuff every day. This stuff has cyber vulnerability. And my personal goal, I know everybody up here shares that, is to get you information. So that's my commitment leaving this is to continue this process. We've got some stuff up there now. Most of you probably haven't looked at it. That's okay, but it's there. I'm telling you it's not perfect, but it's a start, and we're going to continue to refine it. And I know I'm continually trying up my game in cyber through various ways. You should be too. So with that, I'd like to thank our panel. It wasn't a smooth... We didn't have the Rockettes up here, but I think it was a good effort. So thank you very much.
It was organic.
It was real. Thank you, everybody.